So again, welcome everyone to this sort of workshop class of sorts on how to live a good life. It's teachings on secular ethics. I'll give a lot more information on that as we get started. I do like to start with just a short little meditation. Always something that's good to do at the beginning of a class when we're spending our time together. And we'll begin with just a few minutes of watching the breath. So again, most of you have a meditation practice that you use to observe the breath. But if you need some guidance, I suggest often using the point at the tip of the nose. This is a nice point to focus in on and just feel the sensation of the air as it comes in the nostrils and as it goes back out. And just try to keep your awareness in that area, just trying to make the mind somewhat single pointed in its focus. And whenever you see that the mind has wandered away, then just gently guide the mind back to the breath. And we're just going to do this in silence for a couple of minutes and then do a short reflection that will help us to kind of move into the material that we're going to be working with today. So again, just find a comfortable posture and then bring your awareness to the breath, and we'll do a meditation on the breath for the next few minutes. So now let's set our motivation, our intention for being here today by first of all thinking about what it is that we most wish for ourselves. There's no problem with starting with ourselves. This is where everything begins. What are the thoughts that you have towards yourself in terms of what you would like ideally to have in your life? What would make your life of greater value, meaning, purpose? What would bring you deeper happiness and well-being? Just reflect for a moment on the things that would be of use to you right now, and developing some sort of aspiration to move in that direction through the time we have together. And then thinking about the people who are close to you, dear to you in this life, can you generate that same wish for them? Just as we want things for ourselves that will bring us deeper well being, can we generate the intention to be here to help others that we are close to have that in their lives as well? Kind of expanding our circle of concern, not just about ourselves, but about those that we consider to be friends, acquaintances, people close to us. Take a moment to do that. Then can we extend it out to our community? Wherever it is that you live, the people you associate with to some degree, and you think about holding all of them in the space of your concern, wishing for them to have what will bring them deeper meaning, happiness, well being, and try to expand to include the community in which you live. And then expand it even more, maybe to the state that you're in, even out to the country that you live in. What's it like to expand our motivation to be here, to wish that all beings within this country that we live in could have what brings them deeper purpose and meaning, what brings them a greater state of well being? And then finally, can we expand it to include this world, all the beings in this world? Can we be here with an intention to help all of them to have what will bring a greater state of peace, well being, happiness, will help them to have deeper meaning and purpose in this world? Just try to hold the whole world in your heart and think that you're here for each and every being in this world. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So again, certainly in the times that we live in, we can see that there's a need for us to have a greater concern beyond our own well-being. And this course is very much about trying to expand our awareness of the interdependence that we have with others and extending our compassion and concern for others. I might mention just a little background on this course. I actually taught this course initially for Thupten Norbuling here in Santa Fe when I was resident teacher over at our center on 2nd Street. I did it over the course of several Sundays, probably like, I don't know, 8 or 9 Sundays, something. So it could be done in a much lengthier way, where each class we go into individual points. I'm going to be covering quite a lot of material today, but I don't want to make it too much like a book report or something. The main source of it, as you'll see on the screen shortly, is His Holiness's book that he wrote on secular ethics. There's another story that goes behind this as well, though, and that's that when I was at our monastery in Nepal in 2015, where I was invited to teach the month-long course there, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, who is the one underneath Lama Yeshe there, his picture on the Gompa wall there, he asked me at one point, he said, I want you to put together a course on conduct. That was the word he used, conduct. I'm like, conduct. And I've thought about it a bit, and I even had one chance to meet with Rinpoche before he passed away and talk a little bit about ideas around this. And he was very supportive of one of the ideas being to work with this concept of secular ethics. I mentioned His Holiness earlier. His Holiness has been very much involved in trying to promote secular ethics because he sees how much we need a grounding in some sort of ethics in our society and in our world. And of course, in Buddhism, this is very much how we achieve greater well-being and happiness, is by being attentive to what we are doing, how we are in the world, our behavior, our conduct. So there's definitely that element to it that is within Buddhism certainly of great concern, but Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on ethics, obviously. And the whole point of looking at this from a secular point of view is to kind of move away from any sort of religious or spiritual kind of connotations around ethics and to really look at what makes sense for our world. So that's the context for what we're going to be looking at. And I do hope that it becomes a bit of a discussion rather than me going blah, blah, blah for the whole time that we have today. I will mention that in about an hour or so, we'll take a very short break just because it is a long time to sit for 2 hours, just to be able to stretch and use the restroom or whatever. But let me start by sharing a few things. Again, I might mention that there were 2 handouts. If we need some handouts for the folks in the Gompa here, I've got a couple myself, and maybe we can make some copies. But those handouts I'll get to shortly. I'm not going to talk about them at this moment. I do want to do a few slides, just because, again, I put together maybe more slides than what I can possibly share in the course of the time we have together. But I may skip over some of these. I reviewed them. I did this workshop again in New York City at our center in Brooklyn last year, and it was very well received. So, and the primary material that I'm basing a lot of what I'm presenting is the Beyond Religion, Ethics for a Whole World. Again, a book that was published in 2011. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but quite a while ago, and it's still relevant in terms of the world that we live in and what His Holiness presents as a guideline. Having said that, I will mention that a lot of what we're looking at is still rooted in His Holiness's grounding in Buddhism. So it's not like we're going to see things that are totally detached from Buddhism, but rather being presented in a way that we can see their relevance for our entire world. So I'm hoping that you can kind of see that and appreciate that. I've got some additional use of some materials that I'm happy to make available. I can even put that out there on the drive during the break or something. It's a study guide for Beyond Religion that was put together by the Dalai Lama Foundation. I don't know how many pages it is. It's quite a lengthy document. And it goes through all of the chapters, and it could be used. One thing, whoops, whoops, whoops. Wow, that one flew. One of the pieces of paper flew on the ground here. Thank you, Nancy. Let's see how many pages. It's 33 pages. One of my suggestions after this, let me take it off screen for a second so I can talk to folks. One of the suggestions I might have after today is that if you would like to even form a small group of friends, people that you know, maybe you already have a book club of some sort, who can all read the book together. The study guide is really quite useful. It's, again, several pages that were put together by the Dalai Lama Foundation that go through a lot of the material that I'm going through in a much more elaborate way. And you could get together and read a chapter a week or something, or a chapter a month, whatever it is that people are doing in their book club. And that would be a way to continue your exploration of this, and maybe to bring other people who weren't here today, of course, to have an opportunity to hear some of what His Holiness presents. So that's just one idea that I'm throwing out there for post-workshop that you might find useful. But again, I will put that document out there. I meant to put it out there earlier, and I just forgot to do that. So again, it will be on the course materials page for this course. When you go back to TNL's website, you'll be able to find it there. Again, these are the 8 main topics that I'm going to be covering, and I think they parallel very much the chapters that are in His Holiness's book, though I think I did skip a few chapters because it just seemed like there were a lot of it was maybe not as necessary for what I'm going to be doing in the process of today's workshop. We're going to start with just introducing secular ethics and what His Holiness means by inner values. This is what we're going to be rooting it in, is this idea that we have inner values that we can find that are common amongst us as human beings. So in remarking on how, in spite of so much material progress in our world, people are still quite anxious and often complain. Does that sound familiar? His Holiness says the following. I mean, we do live in a world where we do have a lot of wonderful, in the first world at least, the developed world, we have a lot of things that bring us great comfort. But have we really rectified things in terms of overcoming our anxiety, overcoming our feeling like we don't have enough, or whatever the case might be? So His Holiness, in the introduction, he says, it is clear that something is seriously lacking in the way we humans are going about things. But what is it that we lack? The fundamental problem, I believe, is that at every level, we are giving too much attention to the external, material aspects of life while neglecting moral ethics and inner values. Again, this was written in 2011. This is equally true now. I think this has been a human problem that the Buddha saw, that many other great teachers of the past saw, and recognized that people need to stop putting all the onus on things outside of us to bring us happiness. Yes, they are involved in some level of our well-being. We're not going to deny that. And that's even something His Holiness emphasizes a little later. But where does real, genuine happiness come from? Something we're going to look at soon is from within. This is, again, a concept that Buddhism teaches, but I think all other traditions would say that there's definitely a deeper state of well-being that we can find by attending to our inner values. So let's look at this slide here where it says what he means by inner values. He says, by that, I mean the qualities that we all appreciate in others and toward which we all have a natural instinct, bequeathed by our biological nature as animals that survive and thrive only in an environment of concern, affection, and warm-heartedness, or in a single word, compassion. Compassion, of course, is going to be a word that you're going to see again and again today because it's really one of the chief inner values that His Holiness is propounding. And of course, there is a relevance to compassion in all spiritual traditions as well as in our culture, just how we live our lives. Compassion being the genuine concern for the suffering that is occurring in others. Certainly, it starts with looking at our own suffering and being attentive to that. But compassion is definitely a universal value. Now, again, having said that, obviously there are different ways that that compassion is seen within any individual. What we're going to be working with as part of today and looking at this is widening that circle of concern. According to the way His Holiness is presenting it, we need to kind of break out of our having concern only for that little pocket of people and ourselves that we feel close to. That's why in the meditation today, I was asking you to kind of move that concern further and further out. What is it like to embrace a more universal approach to having compassion for all beings? You know, something that we all struggle with, of course, because it is hard. You know, we have a lot of people in that circle of beings, as we widen it, who are not people that are warm and fuzzy, right? Not people that we can really get behind in terms of the behavior that they're engaging in and what have you. But compassion is taught universally as a means to help extend ourselves within the context of our interdependence on others, to be concerned about the well-being of others. One book that I'm not going to really talk about a lot, but I will mention as a resource if you do want to go further in terms of looking at compassion in a multi-religious as well as a secular context, is a wonderful book by Karen Armstrong. It was written quite a few years ago as well. What was the date on this? 2010, just a year before His Holiness's book. It's called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. It's really quite nice, and this too could be done as a discussion, like a book club group. There are even some questions in the back that she's put together to guide discussions and what have you. I think that's in here. Maybe it's not. I thought there was one for this. No, she's got notes and things in the back, but she doesn't have practices. But anyway, this can definitely be done as a sort of a way to expand your awareness of compassion and the way that it's taught in various traditions, but it all coming down to this fundamental idea of how we are attending to others. There's that golden rule. She talks about this a lot in her book, where do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I've heard that there's a platinum rule as well, which is do unto others as they wish to be done unto them, which is a little bit nicer, right? Because when we say as we would be done unto us, well, of course, that's very narrow-minded in terms of what brings me well-being and happiness. I want that for others. That's not always the case, right? You know, so we need to be kind of attentive and aware of others. But compassion is a driving force in our culture and in the way that we are connected to others. It is what society is based on. In fact, one time when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was teaching, his translator at the time, Jeffrey Hopkins, His Holiness said in Tibetan that society is kindness. And like Jeffrey Hopkins was going, what do you mean? You know, society is kindness. Don't you mean society is based on kindness or is a product of kindness? And he says, no, no, no. Society is kindness. kindness, compassion, being concerned for each other. This is how we have society. If we look at where we started on the plains of the Serengeti, trying to survive all of these, malicious forces that were out there, various wild beasts and what have you, we needed society. We needed people to come together. We needed to have that safety and security in very small units initially, and it has, of course, expanded into cities, into, states, into countries, into, a global view of the entire world. We have a greater awareness of the interdependence that we have in the entire world, and of course, should have a compassion that matches that. So when His Holiness presents this as an inner value, there are many different values that we could add on to this, but it's really at the heart of everything he is speaking to in terms of secular ethics, to be able to be kind of compassionately concerned about not just oneself and one's immediate circle of friends, but to expand that to include all beings. So this is something we're also going to be looking at to a great degree today. But this is how His Holiness, again, starts, is really getting into the very basic point that this is one of the main pillars of secular ethics in his estimation, because it is a common value that we see in our world. The essence of compassion is a desire to alleviate the suffering of others and to promote their well-being. This is the spiritual principle from which all other positive inner values emerge. So anything else that we have as an inner value is somewhat rooted in an idea of compassion, of having a concern for other beings as well as oneself. Again, we have self-compassion. I'm not denying that that's an aspect of it. But if we stop at just self-compassion, then we haven't really taken it to its greater degree. I'm curious what else besides compassion people would include in inner values. We do have a microphone for here in the Gompa. If you do want to add something, if you could wait for Lou to get there with the microphone. But what else do you think would be included in inner values? We're going to talk about these a little more today, some things that His Holiness suggests. Anyone online or in the Gompa have this idea of, again, what could be the basis upon which we would build some form of ethical guidelines? What are the inner values that you see in your life? Anyone?
Well, maybe kindness.
Kindness is a good one. Yeah. I think that is an extension of compassion we can see. Yes, Barbara, please.
Integrity.
Integrity. That's a good one. Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah.
Good intention.
Good intention. Thank you, Brooke. Yeah. Yeah. Having a good intention, good motivation. Yes, Judith.
In the place where I live now,
Mhm.
there is it's so called. We have 3, 4 men
Mhm.
walking around, and they don't have anything,
Mhm.
and they start taking things from other pages.
Oh, they do. Oh, that's
Or
unfortunate.
times.
Mhm.
And how do you do it and keep it your very friend
Mhm.
all the time?
Yeah. That's a challenge. Yeah, because again, when we see people that are not doing what they ideally should do in society and community, that's a hard one. Yeah. Thanks. Can we talk? We'll touch on it. One of the challenges, obviously, that we see in Buddhism, of course, we always are looking at how do we make sure that we extend these positive attitudes, our good intentions, everything, to include not just the people that are warm and fuzzy, the people who are more challenging for us, the people who do things that we disagree with, the people who are even causing suffering for others. And one thing I will say that His Holiness often emphasizes, which is really important to remember, is that we have to divide the person from the action. And that doesn't mean the person isn't responsible for their actions, because there is a responsibility that is entailed by virtue of that person doing those actions. But it means we have to be able to isolate the actions of the person and see them as separate from the person themselves. When we look at the person themselves, we see that this is one of the things we're going to talk about soon when we get to the next topic, which is our shared humanity. We see that they're very much like us. And of course, they are misguided like us in certain ways, and they might have other ways that they're misguided that we don't share with them. But we're all dealing with the same fundamental situation. And when it comes to our own potential what we have in terms of our ability to transform our minds and develop into greater states of well-being, according in Buddhist terms, that's something that we all share. All beings have the ability to do that. So again, it means that we have to separate and isolate those two things, and we see that the behavior as something that we can definitely take some issue with. That we don't necessarily just, say that's perfectly fine for people to do whatever they want to do in our society, right? To let people get away with stealing things or with, doing, causing other people suffering and pain. That's not a good thing to happen. But we don't ever lose our regard for the person, seeing that the person has some integrity. That was a wonderful word that was shared. Some value, some things that we can, rely upon to have that unconditional regard for them, ability to see them through that lens and have a concern for them. In the work that I did in one of the prisons here in New Mexico, I haven't gone in since the pandemic because everything sort of fell apart during the pandemic. And then some of the guys I was working with moved to other facilities and it just became kind of a nightmare. But, I was working with them there. Obviously, when we have people who have broken laws, who have done things that have resulted in them being incarcerated, they're in an ideal position to be given tools to help change their minds and change their behavior, right? But one of the problems is those facilities are not necessarily designed to do that. That's why Buddhism, with the few who did come, it was received very, very well, because it gives you tools to change your mind, to actually look at your mind and say, okay, how can I actually be a better person in the world? So again, I'm not going to go too far on that track because it's going to take us a little astray from our subject here. But that's definitely part of what we're looking at. We have to be able to see that there are behaviors that we need to address in our world. If we have a good grounding in inner values, and those have an ethical system based on that, that is secular, and His Holiness is going to define what we mean by secular ethics in the next slide, I think, then we have an ability to extend that to all human beings. All human beings can sign up for it to some degree, can see the merits of it, and can hopefully curtail some of the behavior that has become damaging for them and for others. I mean, this is the problem. This is how do we address that? One thing I might mention is, as we are working with the subject of secular ethics, is we really should look at, well, where is ethical behavior being taught, or ethics in itself being taught? Where do people get that from? I mean, when you look at your own history and your own life, perhaps you can see the roots of it in maybe your family. Your parents might have been really central in giving you some guidelines about how to be an ethical person in this world. Perhaps even in your whatever religion you might have been brought up in. I was brought up Roman Catholic. I learned some things from the Catholic Church that have influenced how I look at things and make decisions in terms of behavior, morality. But then there even is, things that we might get through other people, through people we associate with, friends and so on throughout our lives, things that encourage us in one way or another to adopt certain ways of behaving and the ethical grounding of those. Again, it can be varied. But I do feel like in the time that we live in, certainly it's not being taught in our schools that I know of, unless you're going to a school that is, like a parochial school that I went to for Catholicism. I was being given teachings in Catholicism while I was also learning about, reading, writing, and arithmetic or whatever. So the point is that I think there is a need for how we're going to approach this. His Holiness has even put together an entire program. They've piloted this in some parts of the world where they are able to bring young people into this type of discussion about what is good ethical behavior. So my hope, another hope that I have for the time that we spend today, I know I'm still kind of moving into the material more than we are already grounded in it, but is that people can begin to have discussions, maybe over Thanksgiving, if you're with family or friends or something, you might bring up, well, I went to this course on secular ethics. I just want to, bring up a few things that perhaps we can talk about. And try to see what are the inner values that we do all share? What is it that would be the basis for some form of an ethical system that people could subscribe to, regardless of their religious tradition, regardless of whether they even have one? Many people consider themselves, without a religion. They might think of themselves as spiritual or maybe not. But again, how do you make sure that there's some ethical grounding that is the basis for how society functions, how our world functions? This is what His Holiness is speaking to here. Was there anything else that anyone wanted to add in terms of another key value, I think, was there one more? I didn't recall if I saw another hand up. Let's go ahead back to, we're going to get back into this inner values a little bit later today. His Holiness actually ends the book with talking about introducing 4 more inner values that he would include. But I think, again, this is something to think about. What are my own inner values? You can do a little reflection on that, and that's actually, I think, one of the practices that I'm encouraging you to do on the basis of this topic. So where should we turn to find a system of such inner values to guide human behavior? As I said, religion. Well, religion is nice for the folks that subscribe to that religion, but is everything shared in terms of from religion to religion, all the same ethical guidelines or system? Government? Well, our government does have some things in place that are some form of ethical behavior, right? Because that's why we have laws that are broken and people that are incarcerated on the basis of going against something that the government has determined is not good for society. Science, well, science has shown, through studying human behavior and what have you, that there are certain things that we can rely upon. Well, is it something else? Do we need something that maybe transcends all of these or incorporates the basis of all of these, if you will? This is the slide with what His Holiness describes as secular ethics. He says, in today's secular world, religion alone is no longer adequate as a basis for ethics. And if you subscribe to a particular religion, those of you who are Buddhist coming to these teachings, well, then you might look to Buddhism as giving you a deeper exploration of what it means to be a good person in this world, how to behave ethically, morally. But what are the roots of that could be shared with anyone else? What His Holiness says then in that next sentence, what we need today is an approach to ethics which makes no recourse to religion and can be equally acceptable to those with faith and those without. A secular ethic. So there's a lot in this definition. It's not saying, again, that it's totally divorced from religion, but it makes no recourse to it. It doesn't rely upon religion in order to define our ethics. It can be acceptable to everyone. All human beings could sign up for it in a sense. They could see the merits and the value of that because we're going to try to base it on those shared human values. Again, we have seen, are useful for ourselves and useful for our world. So what constitutes a system of ethics being secular? What is it that really helps us to, define that and to be supporting that? I've already touched on some of this to some degree. But His Holiness says, I feel it is vital for us to find a genuinely sustainable and universal approach to ethics, inner values, and personal integrity. An approach that can transcend religious, cultural, and racial differences and appeal to people at a fundamental level. Nice description of everything that would be involved in secular, right? Has to be universal and sustainable, something that we can use as a basis and it will be reliable going forward. Something that can transcend any of these various diverse issues, differences that we have in our world and appeal to people at a really fundamental level, really get to what is it that speaks to them as to how they want to be another human being in this world of fellow human beings. And so this search for a sustainable universal approach is what I call the project of secular ethics. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. It's not a term that has really taken off. I mean, I do hear about it occasionally. I think it's just really one of His Holiness's, really pet projects. He really wants this to get off the ground and to be something that can be brought into schools and brought into places where people will begin to adopt this way of approaching things. Again, seeing the value of it. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, the relationship between religion and ethics. Obviously, we have theistic traditions that exist in the world. We have non-theistic traditions. His Holiness, in the book spends a bit more time on this. But, when you look at religion often is flavored, of course, by the way that it is looking at things. If you have a theistic tradition where you have a God, a creator God, who has made the beings that you are part of that pool of beings, well, then you have a certain onus to God because your creator then is a being who you take a vested interest in what that God says to do or not to do and what have you. When you have a non-theistic tradition, of course, then you rely upon other things. In Buddhism, we rely upon the Buddha's teachings in terms of karma, in terms of our actions bringing forth certain results. And of course, that instills a great sense of responsibility because we then have to attend to how we are morally, ethically in the world, because otherwise we suffer the consequences of that. And of course, we get the good consequences of behaving wisely, behaving ethically, morally. In Geshe-la's last teaching last Sunday, he taught a bit about how a bodhisattva, a being who is intent upon becoming a Buddha, practices good morality, good ethics. You're going to see a little parallel with some of what he taught last Sunday, even in some of what His Holiness presents. So again, in theistic or non-theistic traditions, you do have different reliances, different things that you can point to and say, this is where my ethical background comes from. This is the grounding within what a creator God teaches through like the 10 Commandments and what have you. And then the guidelines Jesus Christ gave in terms of, that Christian perspective and so on. In terms of Buddhism, the Buddha didn't say, do this, do that, don't do that because I say so. The Buddha said, look at the consequences of your actions and pay attention to your actions. There are going to be different groundings, which again, you can't apply universally then, right? Because not everybody believes in a creator God. Not everybody believes in karma. Not everybody believes in whatever else is taught by the variety of traditions. So again, His Holiness spends more time. I'm not going to go into that in greater detail because I think is not necessarily as relevant to what we're going to be trying to do with our time together today. He goes on then to talk, though, about 2 dimensions of spirituality. And this is getting to that point that these other religious traditions are kind of something beyond what is the basic inner values that we can rely upon. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. The first one he calls basic spiritual well-being. And he says this is essentially like water, right? You can take that water and you can do a lot of different things with it, right? You can flavor it and, create something else from it. That's what the religions are essentially doing. That's more like a tea. So some are maybe a strong black tea, some are a bit weaker herbal tea or something. I don't know. You can get into those kind of judgments. But his whole perspective is like, if we boil it down or take it down to that essence, which is the water from which these various traditions are coming from, then we can see that there is something that's at the core, that's at the essence of these. Now, again, to what degree can you find that agreement if you were to bring in people from various spiritual traditions and bring them all into the room, as well as people who feel they don't have a tradition at all? This is something to keep in the back of our minds as we go through this today. Are these really universal values? Are these the things that we could kind of extract it down to and say, regardless of one's, regardless of one's religious tradition, or whether one even has that, would you agree that these are the more common, rooted spiritual values that we all can subscribe to? And it's an interesting point. I mean, and many of you know that I spend a lot of time with our interfaith group here in Santa Fe, the Interfaith Alliance of Santa Fe, Interfaith Leadership Alliance. Sorry, I left out the L, ILA. And this has been something that I've seen as I've been working with people in that group, because a lot of what we do is dialogue, discussion amongst ourselves on various topics. We occasionally read books and go through a discussion of them and try to cull down some essence of them and what have you from our different spiritual traditions. And I do think that much of what His Holiness presents is that water, is the stuff from which these various traditions are made. And we've already looked at compassion as being the main inner value there that His Holiness puts forward. And I think there are others. Some of what you mentioned, I think, are definitely a part of it. Of course, these traditions are taught, all these values are taught as part of the traditions. But it's not necessarily to say that we all subscribe to them and all, act according to them. But they are the main teachings, the main foundations. So I think His Holiness has a lot of relevance in terms of what he's saying, but I think it is something we should be investigating as we go through this. So more fundamental than religion, His Holiness says, is our basic human spirituality. When we nurture this most fundamental human resource, when we set about cultivating those inner values, which we all appreciate in others, then we start to live spiritually. This is one way, I think it was even on one of the earlier slides and I didn't mention. When we talk about these values, we see that they are things that we appreciate in others, right? Nancy mentioned kindness, right? We appreciate kindness in others. We like to see that in others. This is often a nice way to kind of point out the inner values that we have. We like to see exhibitions of compassion, certainly. We like to see people who do have good intentions and who are living those out in their everyday life. We like to see people who are more altruistic, who are less self-concerned. We like to see people who are patient, who are more tolerant, and don't get so, enamored of people who are intolerant and impatient. So we can see that, human values that are shared are all around us all the time, and we have a natural resonance with them. We can look to them and see that they are something that we would like to adopt in ourselves because we like to see them in others. Another point that he makes, which I think is really worthwhile, and a way that we can see as sort of our compass, our guide to how we can identify these. So the challenge, His Holiness says, therefore, is to find a way of grounding ethics and supporting the cultivation of inner values that is in keeping with our age, the scientific age, while not neglecting the deepest needs of the human spirit, which for many people religion answers. So it's not like we're going to take away the tea, right? Because the water's there and they can make a tea out of it, if you will. And all the religious traditions can be supported by the same water. But we have to be able to adopt the water as a way of supporting how we are in community. As His Holiness says, this is what society is. These inner values of kindness and so on. We cannot have a world that thrives and survives until we've adopted some universal values that we can all live by. So His Holiness proposes that we ground such ethics in human nature. But it does lead us to that question, what's the essential orientation of human nature? Are we predominantly oriented toward destructive tendencies such as violence, aggression, competitiveness? If you look at the history of humanity, you might say that there's a lot of that going on, right? And even how this country was founded, it was quite destructive, right? The violence reaped upon the First Nations people who were here prior to the Europeans coming here. A lot of aggression, competitiveness. Or is human nature more oriented towards kindness, gentleness, compassion? Or is it somewhere in between? I know there was a book, I ended up ordering the book and I just can't bring myself to read it because it's like that thick. A book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, written by Steven Pinker. But his essential premise is that better nature, better angels of our nature, that is kind of the core of human beings. That we can see that at our deepest level, we can trust in some kindness, some gentleness, some compassion, some concern. But there are a lot of people, obviously, who would argue with that. And Steven Pinker in the book apparently shows how over time we actually have moved further and further away from those first tendencies that I put on the screen that, His Holiness was questioning, more destructive tendencies. Yet, look at the world we live in. We're not without them completely, right? Look at the wars going on the other side of the world. Look at all the conflicts still happening in our own neighborhoods, our own, country. There's a lot of work we have to do yet. But I would propose that human beings are grounded in those softer qualities. I don't know. What are other people's thoughts? Anyone want to share something? Yeah, Brooke, please. And if anyone online wants to share something, you can put your little hand up icon that Barbara did earlier, and then that way I know to call on you. Yes, please, Brooke.
I don't know if many are familiar with psychoanalysis or Jungian psychology, and I don't believe Carl Jung had all the answers, but one thing that he did say is that humans have a shadow, and this shadow is repressions. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just what we are taught is bad. And it's where our animal instinct lives. But the ultimate goal of individuation, as Jung put it, was to marry the ego with the purified shadow. And to do this, integration must take place. And integration is a lifelong process, and you're never, ever going to be completely done with it, but you always have to focus on understanding your shadows. If you don't know your shadow, if you don't know the evil that you are capable of, or whatever evil might mean in a relative context, because it can mean a lot of things. If you're not aware of it and if you don't know it, you're at risk of hurting yourself and hurting others. And this is just my understanding from
Mhm.
a psychological perspective.
Well, it's a interesting perspective that you shared, Brooke, because again, we can say even in a Buddhist perspective that we would acknowledge that we have both sides to us. You know, the tendency towards actions that are selfish and malevolent and whatever are that's there. And I like his perspective though that Jung presented of like the goal is to integrate a more purified view of that within kind of all the good qualities that we do have. I mean, in Buddhism would say that's the goal essentially, is to achieve that integration, but transcend it in a sense even to be no longer, you know, kind of trapped by it and what have you. But yeah, I think his perspective then still comes down to trusting that at our deeper nature, we are good. And it's just that those tendencies need to be addressed and need to be brought to the surface and seen for what they are so we can then work on them. Yeah, yeah. This is a bit of what I'm going to be teaching. I'm going to start a course on Wednesday nights in December where we're going to look at kind of getting to know our minds and really understanding kind of all the facets of our minds. And it's going to be from a Buddhist psychology point of view, but there's very much Carl Jung and Tibetan Buddhism are very close in many ways. So, any other perspectives on this in terms of do we have that better angel of our natures, or is humanity fundamentally corrupt? You know. I think most of you are already Buddhist students, so you probably would hold, you know, that certainly there's a goodness within. So let's move forward then, yeah, rather than dwell on that question. But I think it is something, again, that you might get some debate from people who are not in a Buddhist orientation. So His Holiness points out, though, that if you do have the first view that we are, you know, dominated by destructive tendencies, then our ethics will most likely be grounded in something outside ourselves, right? Some force that needs to keep us in place then. Because if our tendency is towards the destructive actions and behaviors and attitudes, well, then we need something to rein it in. We will understand ethics as a means for keeping those destructive tendencies in check in the name of some greater good, for the good of society, for the good of families, for the good of whatever unit of social behavior is going on. Excuse me. If, however, we view human nature as predominantly oriented toward kindness and the desire for a peaceful life, then we can consider ethics an entirely natural and rational means for pursuing our innate potential. Right? Ethics is just an extension of trying to bring all of that out to help us to live in that space of our inner nature, you know, our human nature that is reliable and trustworthy and good. On this understanding, ethics consists less of rules to be obeyed than of principles for inner self-regulation to promote those aspects of our nature which we recognize as conducive to our own well-being and that of others. I like this phrase, inner self-regulation. We're going to talk later about what the merits of self-discipline. It does take some regulating of ourselves because, again, as was pointed out with what Brooke shared from a Jungian perspective, you do have the tendency to revert to those darker behaviors, to that, you know, side that we need to be aware of. And so we need a way of regulating ourselves, of making sure that we are not going to transgress that. This is also something His Holiness talks about in the book and that we'll get to today, hopefully. We'll see how much I go blah, blah, blah about all these subjects. But so this is, again, we're still on the introduction to secular ethics, but I think sounds like there's some consensus around humans being fundamentally good and then therefore needing something that is in this vein that helps us to regulate ourselves. So what are such principles for inner self-regulation? His Holiness suggests two, and he calls these, again, the two pillars for secular ethics. The very first one is the recognition of our shared humanity, and that's going to be the next topic we're going to look at. And then the understanding of interdependence in human existence. Of course, when we see the shared humanity, this is a natural kind of recognition of the need for compassion because we see that others are just like us. And that empathy that we have with others then becomes the basis for compassion, kindness, for a wish to not just get what oneself wants, but to help others to have what they desire, their well-being. And then the interdependent side of it is the fact that nobody exists completely alone, right? And I think we got this. We're going to be looking at this topic as part of today as well. But we really got this during the pandemic. If we didn't get it then, I don't know when we're ever going to get it, right? Those of you, and I'm sure some of you, were more on the front line continuing to do things while everyone else was, quarantined, staying at home, not doing the things they were doing because we wanted to reduce the spread of the virus and so on. And you couldn't, do that in isolation, right? You still needed people to continue to do what they were doing, to continue to grow the food, harvest the food, ship the food, package the food, all the various things that are involved in getting food to your table. And food's just one element of our survival and our, human existence. We needed people to continue to keep the power sources going so that we had electricity and gas and everything else that people use. We needed to continue to have the roads maintained and taken care of, and to have gasoline that we could put in our tanks, or certainly those of you who moved on beyond gasoline to electric cars continue to have the electricity that you rely upon. All of this, we see that there's this huge web of interdependence that you cannot isolate yourself from. Like, people like to think that I'm living off the grid. Well, to get you off the grid still took the support of many other people, right? You don't just go off the grid on your own by yourself. So again, this is a common fact that we see in Buddhism presented very frequently, but it's not something that is outside of the realm of just a secular understanding, that there is an interdependence in human existence. From these two principles, His Holiness says, we can learn to appreciate the inextricable connection between our own well-being and that of others, and we can develop a genuine concern for others' welfare. So these are the two pillars of secular ethics that he's going into, and I think there's, again, relevance to why he's chosen these two. Together, I believe they constitute an adequate basis for establishing ethical awareness and the cultivation of inner values. It is through such values that we gain a sense of connection with others, and it is by moving beyond narrow self-interest that we find meaning, purpose, and satisfaction in life. His Holiness has pretty high ideals in terms of what he wants for human beings in this world, but it's really rooted in having these two pillars, an understanding of, again, the shared humanity that we have. That's the next topic that we're going to go into right now, as well as this idea of interdependence that is going to come up throughout today, and an understanding of that. I might mention, in Buddhism, this is very much rooted in the wisdom teachings of the Buddha. That the Buddha said, look at the reality that there's nothing standing alone. And I'm not going to go into that in great depth, but that is one of the most core and fundamental teachings, is to even see how our own very identity is not something that exists independently. So when we look at our shared human values, what makes us human, and what defines our shared humanity? Any comments on that? What would you say is kind of the shared humanity? What is it that is something we would say every human being on the planet shares? Yes, please, Brooke.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. I just had it in my mind.
That's okay. Take your
Oh,
time. Oh, you got it? Okay.
There are archetypes that connect the world. If you go to one part of the world and you mention something like a snake, someone in a different part of the world will have a similar understanding based on the fact that we have historically seen snakes to represent danger, something that is hidden, but also healing. You have the rod of Asclepius, which is a symbol for healing, because the snake is capable of shedding its skin. It's capable of delivering a toxic bite, but from that venom, you can create anti-venom.
Right.
And so because of our shared experiences as a whole, this gets extrapolated onto the whole world. And so you see these different archetypes all over the place that people even from different cultures recognize.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. And again, we can say that shared kind of way of having a common history, a common exposure in terms of our culture in this human world that we all share, that is very diverse in terms of different environments and what have you, but nonetheless does have some commonalities. And that leads us to, again, and I think when you talk about some of the shared experiences in the beginning of humanity, of course, we weren't there, as observers of all of that, but it obviously was something that, again, formed some foundation of the tendencies that we had there, that some of it becomes more animalistic because of we came from animals as well, but also the human values that we've developed on the basis of being in community and so on. So yeah, there's a history there and a way of approaching things culturally that's quite common. Any other thoughts on what we have as a shared humanity, things that we share? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Barbara, please.
The basic Buddhist teachings that all beings want to be happy and nobody wants to suffer. I mean, that is such an incredible, powerful thing that we all share.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's actually going to be something we're going to be looking at shortly. That is one that from our Buddhist background that we know. I often say that's the starting point for everything the Buddha taught, was that fundamental understanding that all human beings want to be happy, don't want to suffer. Yeah, Lou, you were going to share something. Oh, that was it. Okay, you were going to tell me about Barbara. Okay, yeah, because I didn't notice it on my screen here. Sorry. I mean, that's one of the most basic ones, right? You know, I think, again, we can see that we've also, of course, recognized our interdependence to some degree and built cultures, societies, cities, towns, what have you, on the basis of that. In the beginning, there was, just an understanding that you couldn't do everything for yourself, right? It's impossible to live completely self-sufficient. And so, of course, we've, built a shared human view of how we need others to support us. So there are a number of things that we've already touched on that we can say are part of this. Let's go to what His Holiness says. In discussing the complexity of the human mind, I am not just thinking of our intellectual or rational processes and our ability for self-reflection, but rather of the entire range of our conscious experience, which includes not just thoughts, imagination, and memory, but also feelings and emotions. So His Holiness is taking the approach of looking at it initially from the point of view of human minds. And human minds, again, have a lot of different aspects to them. This is something we're going to be talking about as well in that course that I just mentioned on Wednesday nights, December, January, and February, kind of getting to know our own minds. To understand that there's not just thoughts, imagination, memory, but certainly feelings and emotions, much more so than we see in the animal world. We're not saying animals don't have emotions and feelings and what have you, they definitely do. But there's a much greater expression of all of this in the human realm. We humans have a strong and subtle capacity for remembering, which allows us to project our thoughts into the past. But we also have the ability to project our thoughts into the future, by imagining and thinking about what might be a benefit in the long term. So again, these are some tendencies that human beings have perhaps a little more capacity to do than some animals. I know some animals still are very much plugged into seasonal changes and preparing for the winter, preparing for, making it through various changes in the environment and what have you. But nonetheless, we see this definitely with regard to humanity. In addition, we have very powerful imaginations and a highly developed capacity for communication through symbolic language. These are all things, again, that are not totally the domain of human beings, but also greatly advanced in us compared to animals and what have you. And perhaps most distinctively, he brings it down to one of the main points, we have the capacity for rational thought, the ability to critically evaluate and compare different outcomes in both real and imaginary situations. Of course, in Buddhism, we often talk about this being the primary value of having a human existence, is that we have the human intellect that can investigate, that can incorporate rational thought into how we live our lives. And of course, that's why the Buddhist teachings are meant to be investigated and to pursue that. But we see this as, again, a part of humanity in general. Everyone has some capacity for rational thought. And then the feeling side of it, the more emotive side of it. Along with these characteristics, we have a further quality which is central to our identity as human beings, our instinctive capacity for empathy. I don't know if they've ever done studies that show that everyone has empathy, but certainly we see it to a large degree among human beings, that there is a recognition when others are not doing so well, when others are having painful, difficult experiences, and a tendency then for the compassion that is built on that empathy, to want to reach out to alleviate that suffering. But it has happened in various other mammals. I know I've seen some of these experiments, right, where like a rat, if it sees a fellow rat that is trapped in some enclosure and they can help them get out, they will often do that. Or that if they take a portion of their food and feed them because they can't get to the food or something like that. I'm not saying that empathy, again, is not in the domain of animals, but it certainly is advanced to a larger degree in humans, where we actually can watch the news and see horrific photos of what's going on in some part of the world and have an empathic response to that. Now, whether all human beings have that response, again, I'm not an expert on that. There might be some who have some blocks to being fully empathic with others, just as we have people who are empaths, who feel almost everything that goes around them, all the various things that are happening, and find it almost unbearable because it's a lot to take in. But empathy is what keeps us connected to others. It's the root of our compassion and kindness, our response to the situations of others. So again, I think these are wonderful qualities that His Holiness is pointing out to, and of course they will be useful in how to address the very fundamental thing, the way that we are all together in this, wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. I did find a definition, or maybe better description, of empathy from Venerable Matthew's book, Altruism. That's quite a tome too, I have to admit. I haven't read that yet because it's just such a long book. Must be like 800 or 900 pages long. The ability to enter into effective resonance with the other's feelings and to become cognitively aware of his or her situation. I might mention that those two things that I put in italics, that's my italics there, they are pointing to the two dimensions of empathy. We do have to feel with others, and that's a common and part of empathy that we often talk to, is that affective quality. We have to feel the pain that someone else is feeling. Like if you see an accident, an accident has just happened in front of you, you immediately kind of feel the pain that someone else is going through, the difficulty of having that situation. But then you need also the cognitive branch of empathy, where you're aware of their situation, understanding it is not yours, and you might be in a better position than to help because the other person is dealing with the actual situation themselves. Therefore, you have to look at what is most useful, what is most necessary to do at that time. These are how we actually have balanced empathy, is by recognizing both the affective and the cognitive dimensions of our empathy. Back to His Holiness, he says, since we are social animals, that is, since our survival and flourishing depend on being part of a group or community, our capacity for empathy has profound implications for our pursuit of happiness and well-being. So he's kind of tying this to our interdependence, right? He's taking, okay, we have this ability as human beings, not just for, again, all the things that he pointed out, imagination and rational thought and what have you, but for empathy. This is complementary to the interdependence that we have with others. Because if we depend upon others for the things that bring us some measure of well-being and happiness, then we need to be concerned about what's going on with those others. We need to have that empathy that looks to them and is wanting to address what is not working for them, what is causing them pain or difficulty, because they are intimately involved with our welfare. And that's where I'm not going to go into too much political commentary or anything, even though that's on the top of a lot of people's minds these days, what's going on in this country, what's going on in other parts of the world. But it doesn't make sense to ignore the other people that you live in community with. It doesn't make sense to bring them to a place of being disadvantaged or not having what they need, because you will only suffer from it. Because of the interdependence that we have to be concerned about everyone involved. That's what this empathy is going to be a major, tool in helping us to stay aware of that interdependence and responsive to it in a very healthy way. In our quest for happiness and the avoidance of suffering, we are all fundamentally the same and therefore equal. So again, this was brought up by Barbara in her comment about what we all have in our shared humanity. This is really what it boils down to. As I said, this is the starting point for everything the Buddha taught. And it's the starting point for many spiritual traditions in terms of trying to help people address that in a more temporal way, perhaps in a more ultimate way. But to see that this is the sameness, this is the common experience, the thread that we have through all of our existence and every being within it. Again, in humanity, I think it's more pronounced because we might be more responsive to the suffering there, but many people are much more in tune with the animals, for example. And got one dear friend of mine who dedicates her life to caring for animals. And so we don't see that this is something that is uniquely human, because all beings are driven to avoid suffering and to be attracted towards what brings happiness and well-being. It's just that in our human dimension, we see how much more we rely upon others and need to be attentive to that then. We can't live in our own little silo and just think that I'm only going to be concerned about my happiness and my freedom from suffering. Because again, no one exists in that way. And that's the basis for why His Holiness is looking at interdependence, again, as one of those major pillars of our understanding of secular ethics. So do you agree that we're all equal, that we're all the same in our basic humanity and in our desire to pursue happiness and avoid suffering? I throw that out there simply because when I did that course that I mentioned back in 2015, there was some interesting discussion, because I often, like if I'm doing a longer course about Buddhism and what have you, that's usually where I start, right? To start with, okay, we're all the same, wanting to be happy, not wanting to suffer. And some people said, no, maybe that's not true. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Judith. Lou will get the microphone over there.
When I lived in my family, I was the only girl.
Mm-hmm.
And when my sister came,
Mhm.
she had everything that you could not work on
Mhm.
from anything.
Right.
And that's why I went and tried to do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can look at my books and you'll know.
Yeah.
But once I went to a place where young people
Mm-hmm.
who are taking care of all the things that are wrong,
Right.
or and made in a way that it works.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to walk back
Definitely.
and say, no, you don't need that.
Mhm.
You just take your time and be with them.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
from that, I have come to be a very funny person. It's so true. And I would ask anybody to come from here and see the people. They are very good. If you need something in your, I went outside of my bed one day, and a guy was banging on my door, and I got up. Wouldn't you? Find out. But I could not touch him
Mhm.
because the people that were working with him got them very well. And then I could go back to bed.
Yeah, yeah. Took care of
Yeah.
them. Yeah, yeah. No, thanks for sharing that, Judith. You've got a unique experience now at Sierra Vista and the things that you're dealing with. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I tell you, I am so in love with all of them.
Yeah. You see their humanity. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't touch them,
Yeah. Right. Can't get to them and change. Yeah.
that wasn't right with my sister.
Mm-hmm.
I could do everything for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember you talked about your situation with your sister and how disabled she was and how difficult it was for her to even live out her life of how many years. I don't remember how long she lived, but that can be very hard when you have somebody who you can't really reach and get to, but yeah,
It is.
Yeah. yeah. Yes.
A few months ago, I was writing a paper about uh, the meaning of the Persephone myth, the Greek myth where she is abducted by Hades and taken into the underworld, and what that means. And I related it to this term, anantodromia, which is, it literally means running counter to. It's the same, dromia is the same root that you see in the word hippodrome. But this word means something that shifts to becoming something else. It first starts out as what it is, but then it becomes its opposite.
Ah,
And I realized that
Huh.
the seed of the pomegranate that kept her in the underworld, that seed is a representation of the potential of humans.
Huh.
The seed doesn't know that it's going to become a tree. It doesn't have any
Mm.
cognition of this. It
Mhm.
simply takes up nutrients and it does what it needs to do in order to become a tree
Mhm.
and to bear fruit and to continue the life cycle. And I felt like this was a parallel for how people are.
Mm,
And
mhm.
people are changing, they're always changing,
Sure.
between it's like light and dark, the sun rises and the sun sets.
Mhm.
And I just felt like there was a profound connection
Mm.
in this seed of potential and being all things.
Right.
And I think that everyone has this potential.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And of course, in Buddhism, just like we're in Buddhist center and I'm a Buddhist teacher, so I will relate things at times to that, even though we're talking more secular today. But we would say that that potential is there for to be tapped for all beings. You know, that even if you are currently not in a state of a human being, that you would still have the potential in the future to attain this state where you do have the intellect, the rational thought, the empathy, and all of these qualities that will allow you to bring that potential to its greatest fulfillment. So yeah, I think there is something to be said for this being a bottom line, that when we talk about beings, this is what should be guiding a system of ethics in a sense, is that understanding that all beings are fundamentally the same and wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. And of course, Buddhism would say they have the ability to attain the greatest level of well-being, complete happiness, complete freedom from suffering. Now, not all traditions may necessarily say that, and that's not something we would incorporate into a secular ethics, but we would understand that there still can be things that we can influence to guide people to choose the light more, to choose the way of being in the world that would be more beneficial for themselves and for others. And that would be this, again, purpose behind having a system of ethics. Let's take a little break here. We're at about 11:16 here in Santa Fe. So maybe just 5 minutes or so, again, just a 5-minute stretch break. And we'll try to keep it to that because especially today, I've got, like I said, quite a bit to cover. So again, 17 now. So at 11:22, we will reconvene. Um, so let's carry on and get back to the slides. I just have a few more, I think, on this topic before we go on. So again, the previous slide was about whether this is kind of a way that we can see all human beings as equal, at least. Again, in Buddhism, we would say all beings are equal in this way, regardless of what their individual situation is. They're all seeking happiness, avoiding suffering. But His Holiness goes on to say this is an important point. For if we can integrate an appreciation of this fundamental equality into our everyday outlook, I am very confident that it will be of immense benefit, not only to society at large, but also to us as individuals. When I went back through this, I was reminded of Richard Gere. Of course, many of you know of Richard Gere, practicing Tibetan Buddhist, very close to the Dalai Lama, was close to Rinpoche and other teachers in our tradition. And he was talking about how, and this was in the video for Discovering Buddhism for, I think, the module on bodhicitta. He was talking about how he made his practice for some period of time where every person that he saw, any being that he came across, his initial thought would be, may you be happy. And that takes, of course, a cognizance and awareness that the being wants happiness, that is what they desire. And holding that thought, he said it totally transformed how he met every person, every being that he came across. So if we have that thought, if we have that awareness, it's transformative for ourselves, but it also, of course, affects how we are with others and therefore has an impact on them. If every being that you meet, regardless of what they are doing, even if it's somebody knocking at your door, like Judith was relating, don't know what's going to be there when you open the door. If you have that unconditional regard for them and wish them to be happy, or at least have the cognizance that this is a suffering being who wants to not suffer, a being who wishes to be happy, it can be totally transformative. So that's, again, part of this underlying understanding of shared humanity that he says is the first of the two pillars for secular ethics, is to really appreciate that this is where we're all coming from. Now, of course, when we start talking about happiness for beings and beings experiencing happiness, we have to talk about what happiness is. There's a lot of different views on this, right? So this is the next topic that I want to spend a bit of time on, investigating what His Holiness calls genuine happiness. So if we accept that human beings are fundamentally oriented toward the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of suffering, it remains to be explored what is meant by happiness and where it might come from. What are the causes of happiness? And this is this whole topic that we're going to go into now that I think is really quite relevant to the whole discussion of secular ethics. Happiness is a rather general term, so there is potential for misunderstanding. For example, it should be made clear that in this book's secular context, we're not talking about religious conceptions of ultimate happiness, but rather the simple joy or happiness we all understand in an ordinary or everyday sense. And this is important to articulate. Once more, all of those religions are like the tea that you make out of the water that is the fundamental basis of our inner values and what have you. Similarly, we can't really talk about wishing for a more ultimate happiness for all beings to have in this world that we live in right now, because that isn't something that all beings connect with. The Buddhist view of ultimate happiness is nirvana, going on to really the full nirvana of Buddhahood. That is what we would ideally want for all beings. There's nothing stopping us from having that wish ourselves. But when we talk about secular ethics, that's got to be divorced from the picture, right? Because that's not the goal. The goal is not to have a system of ethics that supports everyone attaining nirvana. It's the system of ethics that supports everyone having some measure of happiness in their life, having a good life, having a life where their well-being is not being challenged all the time. So this is the idea behind happiness in this context. Right off the bat, His Holiness says, don't equate it to the ultimate happiness that a religious tradition or spiritual tradition would put forward. So what are the sources of happiness at that level that we're talking about? We talk about kind of the general way that we experience happiness as human beings in this world. You don't want to go too lofty with that view of happiness. His Holiness identifies three factors that suggest themselves immediately to that he says that I think most people will agree contribute significantly to human well-being. And these are wealth or prosperity, health, and friendship or companionship. And I think there's something to be said for all three of these, right? I mean, when we look at the world that we live in, most of the suffering in the world comes from a lack of wealth and prosperity, people suffering because resources are scarce. And look at what's happening with migrations in this world, people going to other countries because their countries have become unable to support life. I was reading an article quite some time ago now in the New York Times about the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates that's always called the birthplace of civilization. It's inhabitable now. There's no water there. I mean, this was like a rich Garden of Eden from which human life sprung. And it's now, impossible. So we see that definitely having enough resources, wealth, prosperity, what have you, is an important factor in terms of just general happiness in this world. We need to do, what we can to rectify that. So again, this is understandable as one of the factors. Health. Of course, if you don't have good health, if you don't have even the ability to receive medication and other treatment to address issues with health, then that can be a source of greater suffering in our world. and people don't live from long lives. They don't have access to many other things because of poor health. And then friendship or companionship, the fact that we do depend upon others. We're social animals. I know that there are many people who might say, well, I'm tired of the human race and I'd rather just not be involved anymore, because we have made a mess of things. But nonetheless, we need each other. We need friendship. We need companionship. We need other people that are part of our circle of support and that help us in a variety of ways. And of course, we need larger and larger circles of that. That isn't isolated only to the people that we call our friends, but the reality of that interdependence. Of course, wealth and prosperity bring benefits. As humans, we need decent shelter, healthy environment, nutritious food, clean water. These are our fundamental needs, and as such, are prerequisites of human happiness. However, while the further benefits of wealth, a new house, a new car, a new telephone, whatever iPhone they're up to now, 17, I don't know, what is it? I have no idea. Those may provide some temporary increase in our level of comfort or daily convenience. There's no guarantee that they will bring any lasting satisfaction. This is one of the things, if we look at resources and wealth, those aren't something that bring greater happiness over time, right? The more that you get, often the more worried you get about what you possess, the more it even complicates your lives. There's some kind of diminishing returns when you have more wealth and resources. Whoops. In fact, acquiring ever more possessions often leads to greater anxiety, stress, and worry. That can in turn feed anger and even resentment. I mean, look at all the greed that exists in the world and the driving forces behind a lot of that. So much more important than all of that is our inner or mental state of being. Members of a poor family, and we certainly, if you travel to parts of the world where they're not as developed and they don't have as many resources, they don't have the new phone every month and what have you. I mean, you can still see that people are happy if there's affection, kindness, trust. Their rich neighbors may live in luxury, but if suspicion or resentment besets their minds, they'll have no genuine happiness. So again, wealth and resources can be seen as somewhat faulty. Health can be seen as faulty. I'm not going to go through reading all of these because I think it's pretty obvious. Looking after our physical health, as he says, there is crucial, because you can't have a good life without good health to some degree. But if we consider it entirely physical and don't, attend to our mental health, our emotional factors, again, then that would be definitely a mistake, because having good physical health and being happy are not necessarily a direct link. There can be some increase in our happiness by having good health, but it doesn't solve the whole fundamental issue, especially if our minds are not addressed. Okay, so let's consider friendship. Certainly having a circle of people around you is important. We're social animals. Relationships with others are crucial to our well-being. But again, we have to recognize that even in our world, there's some relationships that are more superficial. Sometimes people put too much onus on friends and what have you, and you can end up with a lot of pain by virtue of the way that friends don't necessarily abide with what you do or what have you, disagree with you. So again, it's clearly the case that genuine friendship can only be based on trust and affection, which once more can only be there when we have this mutual sense of concern. So, whoops. Let me stop there. So again, what His Holiness was really pointing out, and I'm sorry, I went through those slides a little bit faster, but I'm just recognizing the time limitations we're going to have today, is that when we look to some of the things that often are the source of our well-being, and that people tend to put more importance on, that's one of the issues that we have to address, is like if we are going to talk about resources, having a circle of supporters, friends, and what have you around us, those are wonderful to have, and they do contribute to our well-being, but they aren't reliable. They aren't the things that we can actually find as causes of more sustained happiness and well-being. They're necessary. And this goes back to when I was in college, I studied Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Most of you have heard of this, where essentially you have to have your basic needs covered. You have to have shelter, you have to have food and resources and things. And then perhaps other things can be dealt with. I mean, we do have to, recognize the importance rests on those higher parts of the ladder, where we actually are addressing why we are here, what our purpose in life is, and so on. But if you don't have foundational stuff, it's very difficult to do that. So importance of these things, but it seems to be going out here. I don't know if it's battery or, um, I don't know if they're hearing me online then when it goes out. No, it's going, thumbs up. Okay, good. All right, so again, when we look at these things, we see that they are an important part of having some contentment in our lives, some ability to live a good life, but they are not the final means of producing, I don't know, genuine happiness. And this is the term His Holiness uses, that we're going to be exploring the dimensions of that. So going back to the slides, so feelings of trust and loving kindness, which counteract feelings of isolation or loneliness, don't come from the mere external presence of others or from the outer appearance of friendship, but from one's own attitude of concern and respect towards those others. So with regard to all three of these, to some degree, the ultimate source of happiness is within us. Those factors play a role. They give us some measure of happiness, pleasure in our lives, but they are not the final result. So these considerations reveal that when we speak about happiness, we are often mixing up two quite different and largely independent states, two levels of satisfaction. Again, in Buddhism, we speak of these frequently. We have the pleasurable feelings that are derived from positive sensory experiences in the external world, which, as we see, again, can be very unsatisfactory at times. It doesn't do the trick. Those things don't always give us the happiness we're seeking. And then there's our inner state of being, having peace of mind, a purpose to our lives beyond our own well-being, and a connection to others through a feeling of community. These are the more important sources of happiness that we have to look to. So this deeper level of satisfaction that is not from external stimuli, but from our own mental state. And he says that is what he refers to when he talks about genuine human happiness. I'm curious what people think about this. I mean, do you think that people in general, because most of us, again, are coming from a Buddhist background, do we think people in general would attribute more reliability, if you will, to an inner source of happiness or an external source of happiness? I know where the people tend to go. I mean, because look at our culture and look at advertising and everything that exists and corporate America and all of that to try to satisfy things on an external basis, right? We give them this and give them that and give them all these things and it'll keep everyone happy, kind of sedate the masses, but does it really do the trick? I don't know. I think it's a tough one because we don't want to, I mean, we can see the relevance of it, but I think it's hard for people to subscribe to it. Don't you? I don't know. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. Anyway, this is something which, again, Buddhism definitely propounds, and I think, as I said way at the beginning, His Holiness certainly infuses into his view of secular ethics, Buddhist principles. Western psychology certainly has its way of addressing deficiencies that we have mentally that can be rectified in order to achieve greater states of well-being when people go through therapy and what have you, and actually spend time investigating what their mental makeup is in a Western perspective. They can have some contribution to their welfare from the basis of that. So maybe from that vantage point, we can see that in a culture that already does accept Western psychology, they could see some benefit to things that are more internal versus the external sources of well-being. I think that's a hard sell to some degree, because I think we have a culture that very much supports having all the external stimuli and may not necessarily see that they're that dissatisfied, that there's greater sources of satisfaction within themselves. With inner resilience, it is possible, even in extremely aggravating circumstances, to maintain a degree of happiness. And yet, without this inner strength, no amount of central gratification can ever make us happy. Again, I think that we all get it from a Buddhist point of view, but I think that's a hard one for many people to see. Some people may still feel like they will continue to look to things outside themselves for some form of gratification, even in the face of those things failing them. But if peace of mind is our first defense against hardship and suffering, there are also other crucial factors which greatly contribute to our level of genuine happiness and joy. These are the factors we have to be attentive to. Chief among these are a sense of purpose, which transcends narrow self-interest and a feeling of being connected with others or belonging to a community. Again, I think that a sense of purpose is very important with regard to developing an understanding of what would address a more universal approach to ethics, to help people to find some purpose of their lives, of being here and contributing to the welfare of their fellow human beings. The root of both of these, I believe, is compassion or warm-heartedness. And that's the topic he's going to turn to next. So that's really, again, kind of taking us into the fourth topic. So this was a rather short topic, but I think it's an important one. Like if we say, okay, we're trying to build an ethical system, a secular approach that is trying to address how to bring a greater state of well-being to humanity as individuals, but also as a whole. Well, then we have to understand, well, what is it we're trying to accomplish? Are we really just simply trying to get, everybody to have the latest gadgets and the latest devices and all the wonderful things that they need physically, externally? I think we really have to address whether, more importantly, we should be trying to help them to have some inner shift, some inner sense of well-being and happiness that they can rely upon on a more ongoing basis. And of course, that is rooted very much to a sense of purpose. When you have a sense of purpose to your life, if people are just wandering through life feeling like there's really nothing that they're here to accomplish or to do, well, then that doesn't lend themselves to being very happy, right? Kind of adrift. And I know people like that. And I've even worked with students like that who are, come to Buddhism often expecting that it will provide that for them, but maybe there's no resonance with what Buddhism puts forward. Different spiritual traditions do have things that they emphasize in terms of how to use this life meaningfully. But if we can create an environment where people come to rely upon themselves, look at their inner sources of happiness, then perhaps once more they will see that a sense of purpose contributes to that and helps to, kind of make that dimension of their lives more meaningful and more purposeful. So let's talk about compassion. Again, compassion is in all spiritual traditions. I pointed out that book earlier by Karen Armstrong and the work that she's done. By the way, she started a whole project that she received some money, some award for her work in the field of compassion. And she started a project called Compassionate Cities. And there are different cities that try to promote compassion within their environs. His Holiness points out how much we depend on warmth and affection in our human lives, beginning with infancy, during our prolonged period of nurture, although this obviously continues throughout life and even when we reach the end of our lives. Those who are kind of at the beginning of life and at the end of life is when we probably depend upon others the most, but we depend upon others throughout our lives. And of course, compassion is the way that we respond to the needs of others. In all this, I do not want to propose that our well-being is entirely passive or dependent on the way others treat us. Even more important than the warmth and the affection we receive are the warmth and affection that we give. It's a pretty profound statement. I think what he's getting at here again is that we can acknowledge that we are the recipients of so much. That concept of interdependence that we talked about earlier, that other pillar of secular ethics. That is showing us that we are dependent upon others and that we need to rely upon them in that regard. But don't want to make it sound like that's the only source of our well-being or our happiness. We also, again, find things within ourselves. And this compassion is definitely a source of greater well-being. And it's interesting to say that because compassion is not, at least at times, something that feels good, right? As I said, turn on the news, watch what's going on in Gaza, watch what's going on in various parts of the world where there's great suffering. It doesn't feel good in that moment to be facing the suffering that other human beings are inflicting on other human beings or whatever is going on the screen. But compassion has a quality to it that is very much contributing to our welfare in the long term, allowing us to be able to be responsive to what's happening in our world and not seclude ourselves from it and think that we can be independent of it in some way. It's taking onus for that shared humanity that we see on the screen in front of us and our ability to respond effectively to it. And it can have more positive effects over the long term. This is why it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of emphasis in Western psychology on positive emotions. But their tendency, in my understanding, again, I'm no expert on Western psychology, has been on those emotions that feel good. Because emotions that feel good, such as joy and Even like generosity, giving things to others often feels good, right? Like that's why we have these holidays where we give gifts to others and what have you. Birthdays, you wanted to give to others because it feels good to be in a giving place, right? And those are wonderful emotions. We're not denying their importance. But some emotions don't feel good when we're experiencing them, but they are actually very positive for us. And compassion is one of those. So this is the section that we're on now, is emphasizing the importance of compassion and the ability that we can develop this kind of warm-heartedness, this warmth and affection that we give towards others on the basis of our response to their situation. It is through giving warmth and affection, through being genuinely concerned for others, in other words, through compassion, that we gain the conditions for genuine happiness. For this reason, loving is of even greater importance than being loved. You know, being compassionate is more important than being cared for by others. You know, this is the deeper sources of well-being that we see within our human minds. So now some are the observations that he has around compassion, which I think are important to put out there. Again, I'm not going to share as many words from him on this section. First of all, it's not a religious practice, although, as I mentioned previously, it's central to the ethical teachings of all major religions, right? Buddhism does not have a monopoly on compassion. Compassion is a common thread going through every spiritual tradition to some degree. And they might also teach things that might sound contrary to universal compassion. That's not something we're going to go into today, but compassion is always there. Secondly, it is good not just for others, but also for oneself, in that it reduces our fear, boosts our confidence, and brings us inner strength. Again, these things can take time to develop. So in the moment, it might feel very uncomfortable to be in a place of compassion, to be responding to the suffering around us. But over time, you become more confident. It becomes what we often refer to as courageous compassion. You get a lot more inner strength, and we aren't quite as fearful in confronting the difficulties in our world. But I have to admit, I've never been that much of an activist in my life. I know Space came in and she was a great activist in the 60s and what have you around civil rights and that. But I'm sure she can speak to her experience that once you start putting, the initial discomfort is there perhaps, but once you start putting yourself out with a more compassionate stance around things, then it becomes easier, right? True? She's shaking her head, yes. You know, that you acclimate yourself to be in that place of that courageous conviction to do something about the disadvantages, the injustice that we see in our world and addressing it. So that's an example, again, of how compassion over time becomes a greater source of well-being for ourselves. But initially, it might feel a little awkward. It might feel a little uncomfortable. One friend of mine told me, we never grow unless we're outside of our comfort zone. And that's how compassion and some of these emotions work, is they take us outside of our comfort zone, and we can actually grow and develop on the basis of that. So he says, compassion is a marvel of human nature, a precious inner resource, and the foundation of our well-being and the harmony of our societies. If therefore we seek happiness for ourselves, we should practice compassion. If we seek happiness for others, we should also practice compassion. What His Holiness often speaks to as being wisely selfish. If you really want to attend to yourself and your own well-being, then tend to the well-being of others. All right, oops, I didn't mean to hit that button. Let's carry on with a few more bits. We've got about another 10 minutes or so before our lunch break. So His Holiness then speaks to two levels of compassion that he's identified. The biological level, which is exemplified by the affection of a mother for her newborn child. In fact, we often, in Western psychology, I understand they use this idea of a kind of attachment. They use that term to refer to the bond that happens between a mother and child often, though it can also be other caregivers. But the idea that that is necessary in order for there to be a healthy relationship and a healthy response to that biological need that one has early on in life. But then there's the extended level, which has to be deliberately cultivated into what His Holiness calls universal compassion. And that's what I was encouraging you to exercise that muscle with the motivation today, of not just to be content with having a wish for the well-being of those that are very close to you now, but going beyond that. It starts off with a biological connection, obviously, and the people that we feel most close to, but that can change by virtue of cultivating that mind. Extended universal compassion isn't rooted in any self-regarding element, but rather in the simple awareness that all others are human beings who, just like oneself, aspire to happiness and shun suffering. So again, he's taken the previous section where he was looking at kind of our shared humanity and what goes on for us in terms of our experience, where we are coming from, and has united it with this idea of universal compassion. Now, again, this is a hard concept, I think, for a lot of people in our world to think that they need to have compassion for even the people who are opposed to them, who are doing things that they find quite difficult and challenging in our world. But as I pointed out in response to what Judith brought up earlier today, we need to be able to separate the person from their actions. And we can universally even condemn the actions of people who are involved in causing suffering to others, and yet have a compassion for them as a suffering being. And that's the logic that His Holiness often is coming from. And I think it can be seen as a rational way of looking at it, but can still have a great block in terms of how people would adopt that. I think universal compassion is a nice idea, but I don't know that everybody's ready for it. It's quite radical. I don't know. So with that kind of compassion, our feeling of concern for others is then completely stable and unaffected by the attitude they may have toward us. Because once more, we see them through that light, regardless of what behavior they might be doing towards us or others that we care about. Even if others threaten or verbally abuse us, our compassion for them remains. So again, more points about universal compassion then. It might sound idealistic, but it's really an essentially practical and indeed necessary element of our society. How can we shut ourselves off to the suffering of other people? I mean, I can't help but again think of what's going on with Israel and Gaza, and it seems like there is just a total negligence of the suffering that is happening in Gaza to so many people, right? That they're looking upon it as they're their neighbors essentially, right? They are right there. This is the Gaza Strip and Israel, it's right there, and they are not, in my estimation. Again, I'm not trying to be anti-Semitic or anything. That's not where my comment's coming from. It's a human observation about, and this happens often when we have people at war. It's happening with Russia and Ukraine on both sides, where there's a lack of an ability to see the suffering that is being inflicted on another being. Universal compassion isn't just idealistic. It's really what's necessary for us to live in a world where the needs of all beings are met, where people have what they are seeking. Again, where they're able to access more genuine happiness by virtue of having those initial things that will safety, security, food, everything that allows them to then go deeper with regard to their lives. So a system of secular ethics is reliant upon that because that is what is essential for a functioning society. A society that isn't going to get caught up in war and continuing to inflict suffering upon other human beings, much less animals and what have you. It's also not religious, since at its root, it is the determination to alleviate the suffering of others, which can be seen in many individuals, regardless of their religion or their lack thereof. Again, many people will come to relieve the suffering of others without any religious background whatsoever. They're not called upon to do that by virtue of some religious teaching. They just see the suffering and they want to address it. Right? People are suffering, I have to feed them. I have to do whatever I can to help them. So it's not essentially religious, though most religions, again, will have some element of it. It doesn't require us to be any kind of special person or saint. I think this is a misnomer, and this is what some people will feel is like, well, you're asking me to be compassionate towards all beings. Only certain people can do that. Only the Dalai Lama can do that. Only Mother Teresa can do that. Only these people who are highly developed can do that. But again, this is something that we can see that even ordinary people will show that level of concern for complete strangers. That happens often, right? I've been always kind of heartened by seeing videos where like somebody will have an accident and the car starts on fire, and complete strangers that are spectators, they just saw the accident happen, will come and put their own lives at risk to help drag that person out of the burning car, right? And that shows universal concern, right? Because that could be a person even that's involved in harming them from a distance. Maybe they're involved in the government that is opposed to them or doing something that is, not beneficial for the world. But they don't care at that point. They see suffering And they know that their job is to help address that suffering and remove that person from that situation. So again, it doesn't take people who have, extraordinary powers or something. It just means that we have to be aware of being responsive to the suffering of the world. It also does not entail this like heaviness of taking on the woes of the world, kind of experiencing some form of, overwhelm. Again, maybe if you're an empathic person who has that level of identification with the suffering of others, it might be very challenging. But as His Holiness says here, although there is some discomfort initially involved when you empathize with others in distress, having voluntarily chosen to open yourself to the difficulties of that other person shows courage, and courage imparts confidence. And that same thing I was mentioning earlier, when you do this more frequently, initially there's discomfort, but when you do it over time, you become more courageous, responding to the world from that place. However, since universal compassion does involve gradually expanding one's circle of concern until it finally embraces the whole of humanity, it needs constant cultivation. Therefore, we need tools that will help us to do that. So let's stop here. We made it through 4 out of the 8. That's not too bad. There's a larger portion of the course in the afternoon, and I think we only have an hour and a half for some reason. I don't know. I thought this was going to be another 2 hours in the afternoon, but I think it's just till 3, and I'll hold to that. But let me see if there are any questions up to this point. We've been kind of setting the stage to some degree. Lou, could you get the microphone over to space? Or comments. Comments are welcome too. I'm just wanting to, again, have some engagement, hear how people are receiving and what questions are coming up. Yes, space.
I cannot have any compassion for the future president.
That's a tough one. I guess it takes work to get there, is my statement on that. I think we can have it. I think we have to look at what is blocking that. If when I think about when we talk in Buddhism, how we often practice generating compassion or even loving kindness, we think about that being in that place. Sometimes I often use these 3 ideas when we're talking about kind of helping. Well, let's just work with the first 2. The first one is how wonderful it would be if they were free from their suffering, and how wonderful it would be if they were happy. Well, if we think about Donald Trump in that way, and we think about, okay, how wonderful would it be if he wasn't suffering? Man's got to be suffering, right? I mean, he's suffering a lot with the ego he has and the fear that must be generated around that ego. That is just, it's not expressed often because of his other tendencies. I would not want the man's mind for like 1 minute. I wouldn't want to be inviting. I mean, it's suffering. I mean, and I'm just I'm not putting him down again. We're talking about a being who is suffering like us, but at greater degrees, perhaps, because again, he's exhibiting behavior that is even more tormented by mental suffering. So if that very first thought is how wonderful it would be if he was free of that suffering, well, he'd be a different person then, right? He might be like the most beneficent leader that we could ever have if he was free of his own suffering. And if I really wish for him to be happy at not just a temporal level of getting all the money or things that he wants, all this power or whatever, but happy at a more ultimate level. If he was actually a content person and wasn't driven by these desires that are just irrational and unhealthy, well, then he'd be a different person as well. So if I'm practicing love and compassion with those 2 thoughts, of how wonderful it would be if he was, in a state where he wasn't suffering, and how wonderful it would be if he was in a place of genuine happiness, well, then he'd be a very different person to begin with. And I can go on to wish him that happiness and wish him that freedom of suffering, because we wouldn't be suffering with a president that could exhibit such type of behavior, because he'd be happy and content and not suffering. I mean, that's the way I have to look at it myself in order to get past what seems to be such blocks that it's hard to have compassion. It's hard to be loving and kind in my thoughts towards him. Again, and that doesn't mean that you totally are fine with the actions that he's doing. We should be opposed to actions that are going to cause more suffering in our world. that are going to cause suffering around the world, not just the United States, but around the world because of the actions that he may engage in. Opposition needs to be there to those actions, but we can still hold that being who is behind the scenes there through the lens of compassion and loving kindness. Because if he was free of suffering and happy, he wouldn't be doing all the stuff he's doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
But it's hard as hell, right? You know, it still is hard. And that's because,
I
again,
mean, I still don't have
yeah,
much compassion for the current president because without the billions of dollars going for weapons,
yeah, I
Gaza
understand.
would be exterminated.
Yeah, I understand. No, and I guess when I see these things, I want to just universalize it too and think that, as was pointed out by Brooke's comment earlier about, you know, Jung's comment on our shadow side, and that we all have those same tendencies. We wouldn't see others' greeds or other people's ignorance or other people's whatever if we didn't have those things in ourselves. So to be cognizant that although we see individuals that we might attribute particular things in the world to and think that the suffering is coming from them, the suffering is coming from the delusions in their minds that we have as well. And to not be kind of looking at it purely as a fault on them or a fault on whatever. The fault is within all of samsara, within all of, you know, this conditioned existence that we're involved in Buddhist terms. We need to take our lunch break, but I appreciate you sharing that because that's where most people are, you know, right now. You know, having a lack of compassion for certain individuals, whether it be the future president or whether it be that family member that you don't want to go to Thanksgiving with because you know they voted for Trump or whatever, and you don't want to sit down at a table with them. I mean, seriously, we're all dealing with kind of microcosms of it and macrocosms of it. And we have to learn to approach it from a slightly different perspective. And it takes time. We can't immediately just switch our minds. Okay, I'm going to immediately have compassion for all beings. Anyway, let's just do a short little dedication before we conclude. You know, whatever we've done already in this 2 hours, and we did this with the intention of helping ourselves to have greater well-being and extending that out to all beings if we can. Try to hold that thought that what we've done is actually going to accomplish that. Have that strong intention that we can see the results of that through what we have done here today in these 2 hours. Dedicate for that. And then also think that as you take part in your lunch, it's good if you can discuss this with other people. If you're going to stay here in the Gompa, I know some of you on Zoom won't have anyone necessarily to discuss it with, though maybe you can discuss it with the other people in your household to talk about what we went through and to see if you have some agreement or some questions are coming up for what His Holiness presented so far in terms of some of the foundational things around secular ethics approach. And we'll get into more of that this afternoon, but and just try to eat with an idea of that sustaining of your life so that you can be more useful in the world, can be driven by a greater purpose to help others to address the suffering in the world. Okay, have a good lunch. Thank you. Thank you, Sheila, for being on board there, helping out with. Oh, Barbara had a question. Can you keep it for the second half? Are you coming to the second half? Okay, write it down if you think you might forget it, because I forget things all the time if I don't write them down. And we'll address that question when we convene at 1:30 here in Santa Fe.